Hello. So if you're watching this video, you've likely just been told that your baby needs to go into a Pavlik harness. They have just been put in a Pavlik harness. You've been told that they've got suspected DDH. You've been told that they potentially have a clicky or a clunky hip, and you just wanting to find out a little bit more information on that. So I'm talking from my own personal experience. So my son went into a Pavlik harness at 10 weeks old. He had an initial scan at 5 weeks old, and he completed his initial treatment in the Pavlik harness after another 10 weeks. And we're now just waiting up our follow-up scans just to see how everything is progressing with him. I just wanted to just record a quick video just to answer some of those initial questions that you might have. So when we were first put in our Pavlik harness, I had so many questions. I didn't feel that we were given much information. I didn't really expect to go into the harness, so I didn't prepare any questions to have. And there was lots of technical information which I then subsequently read up about in our notes, which I didn't understand. So I just wanted to give a really quick overview just of some of those initial things that you might be thinking of. The first thing I just want to say, it's okay to be sad, it's okay to be frustrated, it's okay to feel sad for your baby, it's okay to feel sad for yourself. That's one of the biggest things that affected me at the start. Was selfishly, perhaps, I felt really sad for myself that my perfect baby was now going to be harnessed for quite a large chunk of his early life. We were told potentially 12 weeks at the start, and he wasn't even 12 weeks old. So when I was trying to rationalise that in my head, he was going to be harnessed for longer than he'd been alive, and that's really quite scary. So it's okay to feel sad, and it's also okay to feel sad because seeing your baby in a harness is quite shocking. It's a bit traumatic. Your tiny little precious delicate baby is now braced, is going to feel quite rigid. They're going to be held in a position that makes it really hard for you to cuddle them initially, to feed them. You're going to have to relearn all of that stuff. You're going to have to find new ways to do nappy changing and clothes and all that stuff that you think you are prepared for as a new parent. Sort of all goes out the window, and you have to then sort of relearn everything. At the time your baby's gone into the harness, you've likely just established a little bit of a routine. You just feel like you've got your shit together, and then it all changes. So it is a hard first 48 hours, but it does certainly get easier. After the first couple of weeks, you sort of wonder why you were sort of so daunted at everything at the outset, because you do just become a pro, and then when your baby does come out of the harness, you then struggle to relearn how to sort of do everything, and you find you still doing everything as if they were still in the harness. So that's just a quick message just to say it does get easier. So if you're sort of wondering why your baby's gone into the harness, it's likely because they've got DDH. So DDH is developmental dysplasia of the hips, and it's generally picked up in the first few weeks of your baby's life. So it may have been picked up on your baby's day one check. So on the day your baby is born and they're checked over by a paediatric nurse, they would have done some hip pulling and leg manipulation to see if your baby's hips could be dislocated or if there's any clicking or clunking. If it's identified then, you'll generally be sent for a scan within the first 4 or 5 weeks of your baby's life. If it hasn't been picked up then, and it develops sort of in the first few weeks, it will likely then be picked up when your baby goes for their 8-week check at their GP. And again, they perform the same tests that is done by the paediatric nurses in the hospital, where they manipulate the legs and see if they can get to dislocate at all. If they get them to dislocate then, or they identify any issues, again you'll be sent for a scan, and depending what area you're in, hopefully wouldn't take any more than 4 weeks. If it's identified then the likelihood is that your treatment will start later, so your baby will need to be in the harness for a period of time longer. So instead of coming out at 4 or 5 months, they may be coming out of the harness at sort of post 6 months old, which is hard for you as a parent, as you start thinking of all of the milestones that they may potentially miss. And again, you'll feel sad for your baby, you'll feel sad for yourself, you'll wonder what potentially that might mean for your child as they grow up. So all completely normal feelings. So if your baby has been identified with a hip clunk, or your GP or paediatric nurse has any concerns, you'll be sent for an ultrasound. So the ultrasound is really straightforward. Your baby will just be laid on their side, and a sonographer will just take an ultrasound of their hips. The sonographer will be unlikely to tell you if they think there's a problem or not, as the physios or the orthopaedic team will then have to put some measurements on those scans just to see exactly where baby's hips are sitting. DDH is graded, so you go from sort of mild all the way through to severe. So that's from hips which are perfectly healthy to hips that will need to be observed and then rescanned before treatment. A baby's hips which they feel can be remedied through a Pavlik harness, and then the more severe cases are likely to be harnessed initially, and then if that fails may need potentially to go on to being casted, or in worst case situations have surgery. So in case you're wondering what the gradings are, I'll just give you a bit of a run through of the gradings, as this is completely new to me at the time that I went through it. Only on doing research after I sort of learned to understand it, and I am going to sort of read it off my phone just to make sure I get it sort of correctly. So if on your notes or your physio has told you that your baby's got 1A or 1B hips, that's generally okay and no treatment is required. So just to say, when your baby's having their ultrasounds and the measurements are done, on a baby which is under 3 months old, they're looking for angles which are 60 degrees or above. Anything below that potentially will require some sort of treatment. If your baby is over 3 months old and they're having an ultrasound, then the angles that they look for are slightly different, as your baby grows, the hips change as they develop anyway, and they can change over time, and that's why it's called developmental dysplasia of the hips, is as your baby develops, the situation does change. So typically, if your baby is scanned, likely they'll be under 3 months old, so you're looking for a grading degrees over 60 degrees. So if it's a 1A or a 1B, no treatment is required. If you're a 2A, or if you're a 2, the gradings go 2A plus and minus, 2B, 2C, 2D. 2A is where the angles would sit between 50 and 60 degrees. And if your baby has angles like that, they'll likely just be sent away and be brought back in for another scan 4 or 5 weeks later, just to see that as your baby has developed, if the situation has resolved itself. And if it hasn't at that point, you'll then likely be harnessed. If you're a 2D, the grading of the hip is slightly worse, so the angles will be between probably 40 and 50 degrees. You'll likely be going into a Pavlik harness for a period of time at that point. If not a Pavlik harness, they may deem you need other sort of treatment, so potentially a plaster cast or something like that. In some areas they do a rhino brace if your child is slightly older, but generally a Pavlik harness is what they'd use if your baby is under 6 months old, and they truly believe that improvement can be made. I know people where their babies have had full dislocation in both hips, so a grade 4, which is sort of the most severe case. They are still harnessed and that is successful. So what they're looking for is a whole range of things. So your baby's hip may be in the socket but can be dislocated with some manipulation. It could be dislocated anyway, and then they can't get it back in, or they can get it back in. It may be that the ball is just sitting at the top of the hip socket. It may be that the joint is sitting exactly where it needs to be, but just the socket is slightly shallow, so that there's potential for it to slip out. So what you're doing by harnessing it is you're keeping the hips in the optimum position, so an abducted frog position, to allow as your baby develops, the cartilage to turn into bone and to solidify, and for that cartilage to develop, to really hold that hip ball in exactly where it needs to be. So that is essentially what the harness does. If you do go into a harness, you'll likely have an appointment every couple of weeks to check that the harness is still fitting. So if your baby goes in when they're really small, they'll go into a size small harness, and you'd be surprised how quickly your baby grows. So within sort of 4 weeks or so, you might find that you're going up to a medium-sized harness and then a large harness. So within the 10 weeks that my son was in his harness for, he went from a size small to a size large. So that really just shows how quickly that the babies grow. So they'll be checked every 2 weeks just to make sure that everything is being held in the way it needs to. So you should not be making any adjustments to your harness yourself. Under the instruction of your physio, if you're having video calls or something like that with them, they may instruct you to loosen up the shoulder straps or the chest straps, but the abduction straps, so that's the straps that hold the baby's legs in place, sort of at the angles, they should not be played with, as that could definitely compromise the progress that your baby makes. So you'll have an appointment every couple of weeks to check the fit of your harness, and then likely a scan every 4 weeks to see the progress. Once your baby reaches a stage where the hips have corrected themselves, so the angles are now showing 60 degrees or over, you'll likely go into what's called consolidation. So you'll be allowed to come out the harness for a certain period of time a day. This will vary hospital to hospital. In our case, we were allowed to come out for 1 hour a day, so that gave us the ability to bath him, to give him some playtime outside the harness, to practice things like sitting up. Towards the sort of the end of the time that he was in the harness for, as he was sort of just over 4 months, and he would generally be doing that sort of stuff anyway had he not have been in the harness. So we'd be encouraging him to do things he wouldn't be able to do in the harness. Some hospitals, and I know this from speaking to other people, allow them to come out for a longer period of time. All I would say is don't be tempted to take the harness off or allow your baby to come out for longer than they need to. It's short-term gain for you in terms of the pleasure of your baby being out, but then it's like longer term pain if your baby then needs to stay in the harness for longer because your baby's been kicking around and potentially you haven't got the harness back in properly, or the moving around has disrupted what the cartilage has been doing, or things like that. So just don't be tempted. That 24/7 in the harness is brutal, but you just need to sort of get through that period, and then when you come out the other side, it would have 100% all have been worth it. There's lots of tips and things that you can pick up sort of doing things with your baby in the harness, and I have got some other videos which you may find useful in terms of nappy changing and using the car seat, and if you wanted to put a vest underneath the harness to protect your baby's skin. Again, that information is variable depending what hospital that you're at. Some hospitals don't advise you to put clothes underneath the harness, others do, so you have to do what you feel comfortable with and be led by your hospital in terms of what their approach is. It is worth saying that if your baby goes for a scan and they're sent away because they're a 2A hip, you may be told that it's unlikely that your baby would regress, and that's very, very true. Only 20% of babies who are sent away with like a 2A hip regress and then need further treatment. So in our case, we unfortunately fell into that 20%. So my son went for his scan at 5 weeks and both his hips were stable and were just needing to be observed. So we went away really not being given much information, not expecting any further treatment. So we didn't do any real research, we didn't ask many questions. And then when we went back for our follow-up scan, we were told that he needed to be harnessed and his hips had regressed, which was quite surprising to them. As like I said, it's one in 5, 20% of babies that have that grading regress. So it is worth being prepared for that. Also, when your baby does eventually come out the harness, they'll then have to go back maybe 6 to 8 weeks later to be re-scanned. And again, there is a small chance that your baby may regress, and that's the period that I'm at now. So we're just waiting for our follow-up scan just to see where we are, to see if anything else is going to be required. So it's always worth being prepared for further treatment for the harness. Go in and ask lots and lots of questions. Ask more questions than you think you need to. Make notes. what I definitely found was when we went in and we went into the harness, I was so unprepared. I didn't know anything to ask, and then I didn't really feel I had an opportunity to ask any other questions. So I was contacting the physios sort of with all my questions, and then when I'd go to our other appointments, I'd be trying to ask all those questions again. And it's such a lot of information you have to take in about a subject matter that you're no expert in. So ask them to dumb down their responses for you. You know, ask the basics if you feel you need to. But the main message is it's okay, it gets easier, your baby will get there. Pavlik harness treatment is really, really successful. If you're following any groups or you've joined any groups on Facebook, what you will find is that most people that are most vocal in those groups are ones that have had potentially the worst experiences, so their children or their babies need further treatment, and it's unusual that people will participate in those groups if they've had really successful treatment with the Pavlik harness, because they sort of go in, have their treatment, come out and they're done. So don't be sort of alarmed or scared if you see lots of people in those groups talking about their experiences and they're quite negative, because the nature of those groups is support and community, and often people that need that support are people that are going through the worst scenario or the experience. But you will get there. I've got videos with lots of tips. I documented our whole journey, which may be useful for some people, where I sort of learned and was testing things and taking on tips and trying them out, and sort of just going through that day by day process. There's lots of other things that you will learn and pick up along the way, and you will get there. Just stay positive. Your baby is way more resilient than you'll give them credit for initially, and they'll prove that to you as they sort of come out the other side of it being perfectly happy, and even through their experience they'll be perfectly happy, albeit a little bit unsettled in the first few days, but once they're sort of used to it they'll be absolutely fine. But just hold in there, you're doing great, your baby will be great, they'll be fine.